name's Greg. I work with a company called Twilio, and I'm based in Chicago. Well, first off, I just want to thank Ian and Jess for getting me out here. Like, this is, I've been to New York a couple of times, but it's just absolutely incredible. I was texting my wife on my way here, and I was like, the address is 557 Broadway. It's like, I'm performing on Broadway in an hour. How cool is that? I'm a programmer. How's that working? Was that? Yeah, not yet. And Clint is up there. Clint's doing security. Wave to everyone. He's telling me, Clint's a musician. He goes out to a show last night. Clint goes out to a show last night to see some friends, this jam session, and Prince shows up and just like plays for several hours. That's the sort of stuff, like Chicago's an amazing city, but I feel like that's the kind of thing that really only happened in New York. So it's just super cool to be here. Talk to Clint afterwards. He's got a pretty awesome story. He was a traveling musician for like 6 years and knows all sorts of people you know. So like I said, I work for Twilio. Twilio's mission is to change communications forever. Just out of curiosity, how many of you know of Twilio? Oh, wow, that's so cool. How many of you used Twilio in a project before? All right, sweet, that's so cool. My mission as a developer evangelist, the mission they task us with, is to inspire and equip developers to change communications forever. So inspire and equip developers. So often when I'm on stage, I'm focusing on the equip part. We make it really easy for developers to send and receive text messages and place and receive phone calls. And often I give talks like, here's the 5 lines of code you need to do that. That's the equipping. That's not what I'm doing today. Today I want to focus more on the inspiring part. And the changing communications part actually has nothing to do with technology. I'm not really going to touch on that a whole lot. The way I'm interested in changing communications amongst developers today is by changing the things that we talk about. Because there's a lot of things in our community that are affecting us that are really difficult to talk about. And my hope after this talk today is that some of those things will be a little bit easier. So in that vein, I tell you guys something about myself that is pretty hard to admit in a room full of people like this. And sometimes I stand on a stage with all y'all and kind of feel like I'm the only one. And that is the fact that I am a Ruby developer. I am now, at least. I started in PHP in '99 or so. I did it for like 10 years. I took a hiatus, and then I went over to Ruby. So sorry about that. But I know there's like a lot, sometimes animosity between Rubyists and PHP, or Python and Ruby and Python and PHP. I don't really get that. We're all developers. We're all just solving problems, and it's kind of like what tool we're using is what we're arguing about. I sometimes wonder if there's a internet forum somewhere or a subreddit where carpenters are starting flame wars over what brand of hammer they prefer. So what I'm talking about today, like I said, it doesn't have a whole lot to do with technology per se, but they're issues that affect developers, regardless of whatever language you're using. So now that I got the Ruby thing out of the way, this next part's easy. I have bipolar and ADD. And for about the last year, I've been going around to conferences, and I've been speaking about my personal struggles with mental illness, and I'll tell you some of that story here in a bit. And what I've just been totally blown away by, when I started doing this about a year ago, I had the suspicion that there were others like me, people who were struggling with these things and were ashamed just to talk about it. What I've been totally blown away by is just how many people have been affected by mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety or ADD or bipolar. And it's something that we need to talk about a lot more. So let me tell you my story. Like I said, I started programming when I was pretty young. I got into PHP about '98. In 2000, a buddy and I started a .com, back when we called them .coms instead of startups. And we sold it 7 or 8 months later for all equity in a company that went defunct. We basically started and sold a company for what was effectively $1,000 in a polo shirt. But it changed my life, right? Like, even though it didn't change my life financially, I knew from there on out that I was going to spend most of my career at that intersection of small business and programming. But I still went back to school. And I hated school. I was absolutely terrible at it. I was always, I didn't really go to class or study, but I was always smart enough that I could kind of fake my way through it. I could cram the night before the final. And that worked for me for 2 or 3 years. But then once I got into those 300-level math classes, that strategy caught up to me. And got to the point where, my 4th year, actually it was my 5th year, my victory lap, as they like to call it, although it wasn't particularly victorious for me, things got really rough. I had just broken up with a girlfriend. I had moved into an apartment by myself, my first time ever living alone. All my friends had graduated in 4 years. So I was left on this campus, living in an apartment by myself, faced with this failure of, I was gonna fail out. At least it didn't look like I was gonna finish. And I didn't know how to tell my parents. I didn't know how to tell anyone around me. So I hid, and I just avoided everything. Back then, I was sleeping 12 to 16 hours a day. When I get depressed, the most obvious symptom is that I sleep a lot. I'll stay up really late, and I'll sleep past noon. And at the time, that year, I had pretty much stopped going to class. I had stopped going to work. And like I said, most of my friends were gone, so no one was really noticing. But I did have this one friend, this guy named Bill, who I worked with. And Bill noticed, and he'd sent me a couple emails, and he said, "Hey, Greg, what's going on? Is everything okay?" And I ignored him. And then one day, it was about 2 o'clock on a Wednesday, and I was still in bed, and Bill calls. And I see his call, and I ignore it. And he calls again, and I ignore it again. But Bill is persistent. And so a few minutes later, I heard a knock on my door. I was like, "Hey, Greg, it's Bill. Are you in there?" I was like, "You know what? It's fine. Yeah, I was kind of like pot committed at this point, right? I was like, I can't just open the door and be like, 'Oh, I didn't see your call.' I'll just ignore him. I'll go away." But the problem is when you're forgetful like I am, there's certain life maintenance tasks that you just accept are not going to happen. And back then, locking my doors was one of them. Because it's easier to just leave your doors unlocked than to forget your keys every day. So when I heard the doorknob start to turn, I panicked. And at the time, I was sleeping on one of those cheap mattresses you probably slept on in school. It was on one of those metal bed frames that has the plastic casters on it. And the bed had rolled about this far away from the wall. So I very slowly pulled the covers up over my head. And I slid into that gap between the bed and the wall. And I just held my breath as Bill walked into my bedroom and poked his head in my office. And then he left. That's what shame feels like. I failed out of school. I didn't know how to tell my parents that they had just wasted a bunch of money, so I went back home and I lied to them. Told them I graduated. I thought maybe it was just a school thing. Maybe I just wasn't built to do school. School sucks. So I started doing freelance web development. And all the same stuff just kept happening over and over again, I would dodge calls from the client. I couldn't start working on anything until 2 a.m. the night before I was supposed to have the call with them. All through college, I knew I was smart enough to do the work. I knew that I was talented enough to do the work. I just didn't know why I wasn't doing the work, so I just assumed I was a lazy bastard. I had a friend, he said, "Greg's one of the smartest people I know. He's just also the laziest." And I believed that shit because I didn't have any other excuse. And it didn't seem to matter how many times I was like, this time it's going to be different. This time I'm going to try harder. This time I'm going to buckle down, power through it, man up. It never changed. There's this verse in the Bible that says, "I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do. But instead, that which I hate, I do." And I hated what I was doing. And so one night, in desperation, I went to the place that you go when you have questions about life that seem to have no answers. And I Googled it. I Googled chronic procrastination. And it wasn't long before I was reading about ADD, or attention deficit disorder, adult attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That colloquially, people use the terms pretty much interchangeably. And I'd always joked that maybe I have ADD, but I never really meant it, because ADD is what lazy people have when they, or at least what they say they have when they don't want to try hard, and that's not me. But I started reading about it. I went to Barnes & Noble, I read a couple books, I started reading some internet forums. I found this one book by this guy named Tom Hartman called The Edison Gene. And he had this theory about ADD that made it much more palatable for me. Tom Hartman's theory was that ADD was a genetic trait, or at least it was caused by a genetic trait. And he said his theory was 10,000 years ago, we had hunters and we had farmers. And to be a good hunter, you need to be able to go out into new territory every day. You need to be able to scan the horizon and constantly be shifting your focus from like this thing to this new thing that comes in from your peripheral vision. To be a good farmer, you need to be meticulous. You need to do the same thing day after day. And Tom Hartman's theory was that neither one of these two ways your brain work, he called the difference between a linear and a nonlinear thinker, the nonlinear thinkers being the hunters. Neither one is inherently better or worse than the other, but over time, as civilization progressed, we had more use for farmers than we did for hunters, because you can support larger populations off of agriculture. And whenever we'd go to war, the hunters would be our first warriors. They'd get killed off. So over time, that genetic trait diminished in the population. Until today, it's estimated about 10% of the population could probably be diagnosed with ADD. So in reading this, it helped with two things. One was I had a reason. I had a reason now why things were the way they were for me, why I couldn't force myself to do the same thing everybody else did. And it wasn't because I was a lazy bastard. It wasn't a character flaw. And two, was that he kind of made it sound like superpowers. You know, his thing, he said, if you look at those traits that people with ADD have, things like procrastination, things like hyper-focusing during periods of stress, or let's say the negative traits, so procrastination, indecisiveness. He said, under periods of high pressure, those traits disappear, right? A person with ADD, they do their best work under pressure, 2 a.m. the night before the final. But if you take a linear thinker and you put them into a crisis situation, you turn up the pressure on them, they will have a hard time focusing. They will have a hard time making decisions. And it helped me realize that ADD could help me explain a lot of the things that I hated about myself, but it also helped me explain a lot of the things that actually made me pretty good at what I do. And so it still took me about a year. I still didn't want to like use it as a crutch, right? But it still took me a year, and I set up an appointment with a therapist, and who looked absolutely nothing like this guy. Is this woman named Lori. And I go see Lori, take the test, have you fill out a questionnaire and stuff, and come back to you a week later. She goes, yeah, you definitely have ADD. You're off the charts. And I'm like, yes. She goes, but I think you might also have bipolar. And I was like, no, I'll take the ADD. And you can keep the bipolar. That's what crazy people have. You know, I didn't know anything about bipolar. She said I had type 2 bipolar. And I had heard of, type 1 bipolar. It's also called manic depression. It's where you cycle between the highs and the lows, the highs being mania, which can be incredibly euphoric. They feel great. A lot of people who have bipolar are reluctant to get treatment because they don't want to give up the mania. But it can also be incredibly destructive. People make really bad decisions. People can damage relationships, finances, careers. And then you cycle down to the lows, the depression. In type 1 bipolar, those cycles can happen several times in a day if it's rapid cycling, but they're pretty severe and happen pretty fast. My bipolar, type 2 bipolar, is more mild. So the highs aren't as high. Instead of full-blown mania, it's called hypomania. And the lows probably aren't quite as low. But the cycles are more elongated. So what it would look like for me, well, let's say war is described as long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. And I would describe my bipolar as months of lethargy and despair, punctuated by days of intense enthusiasm and optimism and activity. You know, I would have weeks when it just felt like I was on this gradual slide down. It felt like I was trying to crawl up a steep gravel incline. No matter how hard I tried, I just keep sliding a little further down. Everything would feel heavy. It's like walking through a swimming pool. And then one day, for sometimes it was obvious, like something happened. Sometimes for no apparent reason, I'd get all this energy. And I'd stay up all night. And I wouldn't sleep for the next few days. And if you caught me on those days, man, I'd speak so fast. I would journal a ton. I'd fill up journals. Those were the days when I had like 3 new business ideas and ideas for websites, and I have to do them all tonight. And I wonder if it's too early to quit my job. Because obviously this thing's going to take off, and this idea is way better than any idea I've ever had before. And part of the reason I felt like I had to do it all tonight is because I didn't know on Monday if I was going to have enough energy to get out of bed on Friday. And it was hard because, you know, I understood that I had gone through some depression before, but without knowing to look at it, you know, it really takes a large sample set before you can start recognizing the pattern. So I, for the next couple of years, pretty much lived my life like I had just ADD and ignored the bipolar. And the pattern throughout my life had been that I would go do something. It started off really well. So school, you know, started off okay. Then it got bad. And I was like, well, screw school. And I went to Indianapolis. I went to do freelance web development. And I did that, and it started off okay. And then it got bad. I was like, well, Indianapolis, living with my parents sucks. So I saved up a little money. I moved to Chicago. Started a job with a software startup, doing a mix of sales and development. And it's a great fit for me. Starts off great. 6 months, 9 months later, you know, as things got pretty rough. Well, this place sucks. Maybe I'm just burned out on technology. It was right around the time I took a break from programming. So I go get a job in real estate, showing apartments, showing these high-rise apartments downtown Chicago. And I was our top performer for a few months, and then sure enough, about 6 months in, I start slowing down a bit, and by about 9 months, I was pretty much not functional. And I had to bounce from thing to thing to thing because I wasn't willing to consider the fact that my unhappiness was coming from inside of me. I looked to the external factors, and the external factors with the most influence over your life is where you live and where you work. And the one constant throughout that whole time in Chicago is I was playing a ton of poker. As it turns out, people with bipolar have significantly higher risk tolerances than the general population. And poker was a pretty steady source of income for me. And at a poker game, I met this guy named Josh Golden, who ran a small dev shop in Chicago called Table XI. And about a year after we met, I started working there, and I was our 6th employee. And it was awesome. I got to wear a bunch of different hats for a bunch of different clients, and I mean, it was exactly the kind of job that I had moved to Chicago hoping to get. And just like every other time, it starts off great. And then sure enough, 6 months, 9 months in, things start getting bad again. And it got to the point where I went through weeks where I wasn't even showing up to work till 2 o'clock. It didn't matter how many times I'm like, tomorrow I'm going to get up early. Every day I'd oversleep my alarm. And things finally came to a head one day when I had this project that I was working on, and it was due on Friday. We told the client we'd give it to him Friday. I had been in the office till 2 a.m. every night that week, just trying to start on it, not even trying to finish it. And I had left the office on Thursday around 2, and I promised myself I've just got to go home and sleep for like 2 hours. And I'm going to get up early in the morning, and I'm going to finish this. And just like every other time in my life, I had said that I overslept my alarm. And this was the day Josh was flying to Italy to propose to the woman who is now his wife. And at the time, he was just living a block down the street from me. And at the time, I still didn't lock my doors. So once again, I wake up in the afternoon to someone coming into my apartment saying, "Hey, Greg, are you here?" And this time, I couldn't hide from it. You know, I had told myself, I don't know how to fix this problem in me, so I'm just going to contain it to myself. I'm just going to make sure that nobody else gets hurt. And what I had to realize in that moment was that you can't do that. If you're suffering from mental illness, then your coworkers, your family members, your friends, the people who depend on you, they are all suffering right along with you. I set up an appointment to talk to a psychiatrist that day. And I saw him a couple weeks out. I go meet with him. He says, I tell him my story. He says, yeah, that sounds exactly like type 2 bipolar. He says, actually, you're pretty fortunate. For type 2 bipolar, we have some meds, stuff called Lamictal or lamotrigine, because they actually work really well. There's very few side effects. There's one side effect, actually. It happens in a very small number of cases, but in a very, very small number of cases, you'll end up getting a life-threatening rash inside your anus. And I said, well, Doc, I'm pretty sure that if I get a life-threatening rash inside my anus, I'm still going to be depressed. But that didn't happen. It's been about 6 years now. Every time I get an itch, though, I'm really fortunate. I started taking the meds about 6 years ago. Life slowly got better. I met my wife the same day I set up that appointment, and she just came alongside me and just helped me kind of crawl out of the hole I was in. Table XI didn't fire me, even though they had ample reason to. I had good health insurance. My parents were very understanding once I finally fessed up about what happened with school. I'm so lucky. A lot of people who have what I have are not. It's estimated that about 5% of the population has bipolar. It's estimated that about 1 in 3 will attempt suicide at some point in their life. And 10 to 20% will die from it, either from suicide or things like drug abuse. It actually has a higher mortality rate than some forms of cancer. So that all begs the question of why am I here today talking to you all? Out of curiosity, how many of you have a friend or a coworker or a family member who have struggled with some form of mental illness? Yeah. And if you're willing, don't feel obligated, but how many of you have struggled with something like this yourself? Yeah. Thanks for saying that. These are some cherry-picked symptoms of type 2 bipolar or bipolar and ADD, hyperfocusing. So sure, it's hard to get started on something, but once you do, man, once you get working on it, you can just zero in on it. The whole world blurs away. You work for 12 hours, forget to eat, forget to go to the bathroom. Racing thoughts is exactly what it sounds like. Pressured speech is when those racing thoughts try to escape through the small hole of your mouth. Social isolation. Irregular sleep patterns, especially onset insomnia, where it's difficult to fall asleep at night and it's impossible to wake up in the morning. Thoughts of grandiosity, thinking that the rules don't apply to you, thinking that you can solve problems that have eluded mankind for all of eternity, thinking that you are smarter than everybody else. If you are a young adult or an adolescent and you have some of these symptoms, finding software development probably feels a lot like coming home to you. We accept the socially isolated. If you want to stay in your room all night and not talk to anyone, grow a neck beard and stare at people's shoes when you talk to them, we're your people. You want to stay up till 2 a.m. coding and not come to work till noon. Try that shit as an accountant and see how long you stay employed. And thoughts of grandiosity, they're actually almost a requirement for being in this room here today. We have our heroes shout out these calls to the rest of the world, say, come join us. There's that Apple commercial that says, here's to the crazy ones. Because while others see crazy, we see genius. Because it's the people who are crazy enough to believe that they can change the world are the ones who do. We had a guy like that come work for us at Table XI a while back. His name was Caleb Kornman. And Caleb was brilliant. He had worked for 4 of the best rail shops in Chicago. He came, he interviewed with us. We hired him on. He'd only spent about a year or so at each one of those shops, so it raised some red flags. But he was so bright. He was such a good teacher, and we hired him. I got a pair with him, and I learned so much from him. He had that rare combination of being technically gifted, just a brilliant craftsman, but also being a brilliant mentor and teacher. He's doing amazing work, but a few weeks after he started with us, he starts calling in sick. And he starts showing up late. And the excuse is a little bit different every day, and it just all felt a little bit too familiar for me. Now what I found is that if you think somebody might have, say, bipolar, you can't just go up to them and be like, hey, I think you have bipolar. You should probably go get that checked out. So what seems to work is just doing what I'm pretty much doing here now with you, is to share my story and see if they open up about theirs. And he did, and he said, yeah, I've wondered for a while if maybe I have something like that. He's like, but what am I going to do? It's not like I'm just going to cold call a bunch of psychiatrists from the Yellow Pages. So we looked around. He found somebody, set up an appointment for a couple weeks out. His appointment was set for a Friday. On Thursday, he sent the team this email. We were, at the time, working on building the new RogerEbert.com. He sent an email to the team saying he wasn't going to make it in. Then he sent me this email in which he said, I can't thank you enough for helping to guide me down that path to seek some help with these issues that have been going on in my life for a very long time. Right now, I'm struggling with a lot of things in my head and my emotions. It's kept me up the last 2 nights. And that, in turn, has taken a toll on my mental and physical capacity this morning. I'm scared that if I come into work, I'm going to make a fool of myself with our guests today. I think it would be better if I just waited it out, just focus on making it to my appointment tomorrow. I didn't realize it till I was practicing this last night, but I don't know if you can see the date on that is 11/15. His appointment would have been on 11/16, which was exactly 18 months ago today. And Caleb missed the appointment, and then he died the next day of a drug overdose. Found out it was an accidental drug overdose. He'd had addiction problems for a little while. And we found out that he had run out of money. There's this guy, he's an incredibly talented developer, and he has the ability to be making $120,000 a year. On the day he died, he didn't have $100 to see a psychiatrist. Thing that pisses me off the most about this is that, this is a picture from the memorial we had for him, his favorite brewery. Like I was saying, the thing that pisses me off the most about this is that Caleb died from an overdose on speed. Speed is an amphetamine, and the meds that I was prescribed to treat my ADD are dextroamphetamine. My guess is that Caleb started taking amphetamines for the same reasons that I did, because they helped. My guess is that Caleb was just struggling, trying to figure out what was going on in his life. And despite spending his whole life in an industry full of people, as we saw earlier, struggling with the same stuff he wasn't able to find help. Our industry has a pretty long history of tragedies like these. Alan Turing was the father of computer science, and he committed suicide after facing years of intense persecution from his government. And then last year, Aaron Swartz passed away under some similar circumstances. Aaron Swartz was one of the co-founders of Reddit, and I'm sure you all have heard of him. 2007, Aaron Swartz wrote this. He said, "Surely there have been times when you felt sad. Perhaps a loved one has abandoned you, or a plan has gone horribly awry. Your face falls. Perhaps you cry. Everything you think about seems bleak. The things you've done, the things you hope to do, the people around you. You lie in bed and want to keep the lights off. Depressed mood is like that, only it doesn't come for any reason and it doesn't go for any either. Go outside and get some fresh air or cuddle with a loved one, and you don't feel any better, only more upset at being unable to feel the joy that everyone else seems to feel. Everything gets colored by the sadness. Depression causes nearly half of all disability. It affects 1 in 6 and explains more current unhappiness than poverty. Sadly, depression is not seen as real enough to deserve the investment and awareness of conditions like breast cancer, which affects 1 in 8, or AIDS, which affects 1 in 150. And there is, of course, the shame. The shame is what's killing us. You know, we don't have a cure for mental illness, but we've got pretty good treatments. There's a lot of therapy out there, there's a lot of meds out there that help different conditions. But the reason why our friends and our family and our coworkers, they're not getting to these treatments is because of the stigma around mental illness. And we have a cure for the stigma. It's to talk about it. That's it, it's simply to talk about it. You know, if I stood up here and I told you all that I had cancer, I would not be afraid that y'all were gonna say, oh, it's just all in your head. You know, if I told you that I took meds, say insulin for diabetes, no one would ask, aren't you afraid you're just using that as a crutch? These are actually my lamotrigine, my Lamictal. It's my mood stabilizers I take for this. And I didn't take them this morning. And I remember when I very first got these, I was like so scared. I would go into the office and I'd like want to hide in the bathroom, put these in my pocket so nobody would see me, right? Because I didn't want anybody to see that I was taking these meds because there's so much shame. I was afraid that somebody would tell me, ask me like, hey, what's that pill you're taking? Or they'd assume I was broken or whatnot. Never actually done this on stage before. You know, it's weird that we use phrases like using it as a crutch. Has anyone ever actually used crutches before? They're actually pretty fucking helpful, right? You know, the doctor gives you crutches when your leg's broken. like crutches are what let you go out and live your life despite your injury. And anyone who's ever actually used a crutch will tell you that it's way easier to just keep your ass on the couch. But we have all these rules that we apply to illnesses that affect the brain than anything that happens below the neck, which is weird because the brain is the most complicated organ in our body. We talk about the difference between physical and mental illnesses. The brain is a physical organ. Like it's there. Like there are chemicals up in there. There's electricity running through there. And it actually is probably the organ of the body that we know least about. But there is a lot of science and a lot of study that's gone on. And typically the people in our profession really like science, except when it comes to medicine dealing with the brain. And then it's like, oh, that's quackery. I don't trust those people. You know, I understand the reluctance to go get treatment. I was afraid that if I were to start taking meds or if I just even admitted a problem, that it was going to affect my brain. It was going to take away a lot of the parts of my brain that made me really good at what I did. Right? I was afraid that it would affect my creativity. But if you measure creativity by one's ability to create, I am an order of magnitude more creative today than I was 10 years ago. Today, I ship. Like today, I have the ability to start on a project, to work a little bit on it every single day, and I know that eventually I am going to get there. I no longer have to worry on Monday whether or not I'm going to be able to get out of bed on Friday. Today, when the new ideas come, I can objectively evaluate them and say, okay, yeah, that sounds good, but I'm going to just set that down for a second, and I'm going to finish this thing I was doing over here, and then if this still looks good tomorrow, then we'll talk about doing that too. I didn't have that kind of control before. There's a lot of stigma around seeing a therapist. I want to be really clear that seeking help for mental illness does not mean taking meds. It's worked for me. There are a lot of people who have never taken meds and seen a therapist, and it works great. I also saw a therapist for 5 years or so, and recommend it to just about everybody. People feel like seeing a therapist means admitting that you're broken. Well, one, I am actually broken. Like there's actually something wrong, but everybody has something wrong. But two, Michael Jordan's the best basketball player that ever lived, and he had a coach. That's what a therapist is. They are an objective third party to watch the way that you play your game, watch the way that you live your life and say, this is what I see you doing. Is that really what you want to be doing? There's someone who's been through it before, who have met a lot more people who struggle with the stuff that you've gone through and who can give you best practice advice to help you through that stuff. So my hope in talking is quite simple. One is that we just talk about this amongst our community, that if y'all are struggling with this stuff, that if it feels like it hit a little bit too close to home, that you would feel comfortable enough to mention that to a friend or to a coworker or someone at a conference, or come find me. This is me on Twitter. My guess is you're probably not going to tweet me and be like, oh my gosh, I've been so depressed. But you can find my contact info. I'll tweet it here, and my email is on the next slide. Two is that you would, if you've been feeling this stuff, that you would consider seeing a professional. And there's a page on my blog at baugues.com/depression that has a link to some resources to help you find a professional, either a therapist or a psychiatrist, wherever you're from. This is my contact information. I'm going to be here the rest of the night, and you can contact me. And I just want, for those of you who are in the audience who, I don't know, maybe you're in the same spot I was in like 5 or 10 years ago, and you feel like things are pretty bleak right now. And your brain's telling you right now a couple of things. It's telling you it's never going to get better. It's telling you, don't tell anyone about this. They're going to shun you. Don't burden them with your problems. I just want you to know that your brain is lying to you. Things can get better. People have way more capacity for love and grace and mercy than our brain gives them credit for. I just want you to know that about 6 years ago, that day I started at Table XI, I had $1 in my pocket and 70 cents in my bank account. I showed up to work that day and I didn't know how I was going to eat lunch. And now I get to do this. I get to come around. I get to speak at conferences like this, and I get to share my story with people, and it has been such an incredible honor. I'm married to this beautiful woman. I have this awesome job with this great company, Twilio. And I never, ever could have seen this happening before. Like, I never could have seen this happening. So I just want you all to know, if you're going through it, just know that things do get better. But the first step is just starting to talk about this more. Thank you very much. Do you want? Yeah, sure. So we have a few minutes for questions, and then I'm here for the rest of the time. So come find me later on if you don't want to ask a question from everyone. But does anyone have any? Yeah.
Have they been able to scan, show what parts of the brain cause it, have it more direct measure?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you talk about mental illness, it's talking about this collection of illnesses. So for some, yes. For some, we can scan the brain and say, hey, this is. What was it? I read this article. I'll tweet it later on, but it was talking about writers and was talking about the connection between great writers and depression. And you know what? I'm going to do a pretty poor job of summarizing the article, but I do remember there's something about brain scanning in there. So, but yeah, for some things they can, but a lot of this is I guess the way that at least the way I came to think about it is that, say, bipolar ADD. It's not necessarily a binary thing, right? It's not like you either have it or don't. At the highest level, we're describing collections of symptoms. And sometimes, for the stuff I take, it was originally a seizure medication. And some reason they started giving it to people who had type 2 bipolar, and they found out that it worked. And the theory is that it has something to do with the synapses in the brain firing and causing a chain reaction, and someone with a seizure caused them to have a seizure, and someone who's depressed, it caused them to go manic or depressed, and somehow these meds stop. But so what I've started looking at is these diagnoses they are describing people who suffer from things like that I do, and they help point me in the direction of people who maybe have been down this road before and can point me in the right direction of things that might help. But yeah, there is some stuff. And if you find me afterwards, I'll share a couple articles with you I read recently. That's a great question, though. Someone else is over here. Yeah.
Do you take anything to control the ADD side of things, or just bipolar?
Yeah. So for about 6 years, I took dextroamphetamine, Dexedrine. So I took somewhere between, depending on when it was, 5 and 10 milligrams of extended release. So Dexedrine is one of the two major components in Adderall. If I were to go again today, I'd probably just get prescribed Adderall. It's basically this, more or less the same thing. I took it for a while, and so in that case, I really do think of the Adderall for me, absolutely 100% was a crutch. At the time in which I started taking it, my life was so disorganized. I was super depressed. I needed something to help me get through the day. I needed something to help me focus a little bit. And over about 6 or 7 years, I started building up a lot of support structure. So I learned how to organize myself by using Gmail really well. I learned the situations that I work well in and the situations I don't. And then I was also able to kind of navigate my career in a direction in which I'm being placed in environments like this is kind of a high-pressure environment. It's like when you screw up on stage, you screw up in front of hundreds of people, and it kind of sucks, and that's certainly happened to me. So my brain works pretty well in this situation without meds, and so as I was able to kind of push my life into a direction that was a little more conducive to my brain working better, I started going off them. So I stopped going. I went off them about 6 months-ish ago, actually when I started doing a lot more speaking. I would not hesitate to go back on them. If I got to the point where I was dragging again, and I would probably today take them more on a daily, an as-needed basis, but I still have the bottle at home and if I need it, but I've just kind of figured out how my brain works to be aware of stuff and kind of navigate around it. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Twilio and their support of you coming out and speaking and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, man, so I just started at Twilio about 3 months ago. And I've been speaking about this stuff for a year, so they absolutely knew that I was doing this, right? So here's the thought about Twilio is we sell a product to developers. You can't hard sell developers, you can't market to developers. They're too savvy for that, and we tend to run away from anything that looks like marketing. So Twilio's first non-founder hire was a developer evangelist, and their job was to go out and to serve the developer community, with the belief being that the more developers there are in the world and the healthier that community is, the more apps that will be produced. And a certain portion of those apps are going to need to send and receive text messages, and we can't twist someone's arm and be like, hey, you need to put text messages in your app. We just hope that if they run into that issue, then they think of us first. Like I said, you write about 5 lines of code, send and receive a text message from your app, replace and receive phone calls. That doesn't do you any good at all if you can't get out of bed. So my job as a developer evangelist is to serve the developer community. Sometimes that involves talking about Twilio stuff. Sometimes it involves debugging a Rails app. And sometimes it involves talking about things that have nothing to do with technology, but just make a developer's life better. And it's, as far as I'm concerned, the best job in the industry. For the last 3 months, I've been pinching myself, being like, I can't believe this job exists. So they've been amazing.
So kind of like what you're saying, do you find that you have less of a tendency to kind of pressure yourself into high-pressure situations all the time now? Or is that still something that's kind of part of your personality?
Do I feel less likely to push myself into high-pressure situations?
Yeah.
I would say that...
You learn just more to harness it like you were talking about.
Yeah, I feel like I've kind of learned to, 2 things. One, I've learned to give myself a lot more grace. So 10 years ago, say it's 4 o'clock and my brain's just shot, I'd be like, I got to power through this, get this done, don't be lazy. Now I'm willing to say, I recognize that some days my brain's working great and some days it's not. And so 4 o'clock, some days I'm like, I'm spent. We're just going to try again tomorrow. So there's that. Secondly, though, I have learned that I seem to work really well in situations where I wake up in the morning and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so screwed. How am I going to pull this off? And I find that exciting, and 85% of the time somehow I figure out how to pull it off. And so I've just kind of learned to like have faith that if I get dropped into certain situations that it'll be okay. And so there's an extent to which I navigate towards those situations now, knowing that I'll just perform better there than I will in like just showing up at the office for 8 hours every day.
Right, but do you still now kind of cope better on like not doing like the last absolute day or something?
Yeah.
It's like a high threshold of pressure.
Yes, yeah.
More baseline.
Yeah, I found like if I can just write, say like I have to write a blog post, if I can just write a little bit every day, typically that helps. So same with coding. The other thing I've learned to do is I try to focus a lot more on shipping now. So instead of trying to ship this one amazing thing 6 months from now, I try to ship like one little thing today. Or like I've written a lot and I just look at like blog posts like, hey, I got to ship this 600-word product. And if I can just do that, like any one blog post is not terribly impressive, but if I look back at my blog for the last couple of years and it's like a couple dozen or posts or whatever, like that is cool. And so I think I've just tried to learn to do little bits at a time and realize that actually grows into pretty cool stuff over time. Whereas before, those thoughts of grandiosity, it was like, oh, that little shit's not worth doing. Like I got to do something big or something worthwhile. Those big worthwhile things are just a collection of a whole bunch of small, seemingly insignificant things that add up over time. Yeah.
Do you have this recorded, or are we actually recording this to share with other people?
Yeah, it's recorded.
Yeah. And on the Baugues.com/depression, there's a video there too. But you should give these guys you should share this one when it comes out. So.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have other videos.
Yeah. All right. Like I said, I'm around. I am honored to talk about this stuff. So come find me. And I thank you very much for your hospitality. Thank you.